we'd love your questions and comments and suggestions. So there are folks all around the room. So as the mics get passed, Charlie, could you just summarize the recommendations on the citizenship? We talked about technology, we talked about journalism. What were the Commission's recommendations for citizens?
Really threefold. A real educational commitment to civics education and media literacy. That by the time every child in this country is 13, they need to be digitally and media literate. By the age of 18, before they vote, they need to be civic literacy. We actually throw out the idea of requiring high school graduates to be able to pass the U.S. citizenship test. That actually Americans should know as much about their own country as people who are coming here and want to become Americans. That's number one. Number two, we need to create more civic spaces for people to actually gather outside of Twitter and Facebook. I think there's a tremendous role for civic institutions, including libraries, to be able to do that. And finally, we need to find some way to have people connect with that shared experience of being a citizen, perhaps giving back through a much expanded, revitalized, voluntary program of national service. We did debate whether it should be mandatory. I think we came down very solidly on the side of it being voluntary. But I think that this is one of those ideas whose time has come. People like General Stanley McChrystal have been talking about the power of national service in binding Americans together, but also as a way of having some sort of shared experience and shared commitment. And there are many models for everything that I've just described. In the area of civic literacy, there are outstanding programs that are being developed, media literacy. They don't need to be invented from scratch, but this is something, frankly, that the nonprofit philanthropic community can play a major role in pushing to say, we are living through the consequences of failing to teach these things, and not just to kids, to adults as well. We're living through the consequences of bowling alone, and that we need to somehow find ways to reestablish that concept of the sovereign citizen.
We have a lot of questions, so we'll start here.
Yes.
1, 2, 3, and 4, and then we'll come around.
Good morning, and thank you so much. My name is Allison Ashan. I'm with the Blandin Foundation in very northern Minnesota, where we have snow up to here right now. So we work exclusively in small rural places. And in Minnesota, we're really proud to support a program called the Editors and Publishers Leadership Program. I just wanted to name that and point it to you as you think about civics and journalism, because editors and publishers are leaders too. My question is, as you talked a lot about bottom-up reporting, how about bottom-up information collecting and deliberation as part of the commission? What did you do to go to those local sources to inform your work?
We took testimony from a wide cross-section of experts. I can't say that we had necessarily a roundtable of readers, but Knight commissioned extensive research among news consumers and individuals throughout the country on those issues of trust, and partner with Gallup in order to do that. I love that's one of the things I miss from being a local newspaper editor, is that sense of community leadership from that place. And I commend you for the leadership program that you support.
Yeah, and one thing, the Knight Commission did not meet in Washington, D.C. until the launch, so it was very nice to see Aspen's headquarters just a month ago, but traveled around the country, including to Nashville and Wisconsin, and right here in Miami, to hear from people, to share their very local concerns, and would love to talk to you more. There's so much that needs to be done to address the news deserts and concerns about information needs in rural America. Number two.
Good morning. Frank Sesno, along with CNN, now with the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. I'm glad you didn't start at Washington. Charlie, you talked about the importance of recognizing citizen responsibility, and that is huge. You also talked about the need for media introspection. Media is a very plural word. In your work and in looking at some of the best practices that you've seen, what does that media introspection look like? You know, we're going to have a retreat of every media organization in the world and come up with a Bill of Rights. I doubt it. And how does that media introspection, should that recognize and feed the citizen role in all of this? Is there a way for that media introspection to both look within and look out and be part of a solution here?
This is a good question. And I think it goes back to something that you heard about, is that people need to start listening a little bit more. I do think that one of the questions to say is, okay, are we listening to the people in our community? Or have we created this bubble of our own? So I think that's where you start, where you not only address the question of bias, but you address the question of, are we engaged with the real world, or are we basically in a circular something or other that I'm not going to say. And I do think that the one thing that I think the media does need to do a better job is explaining what it does and reminding people of the role that it plays in a democracy. I mean, this is part of the radical transparency of saying we do this thing, not to necessarily because we want to sell newspapers, but because we think this is important. We work for you. We are in the public service. So I do think that that's something else that they could do as part of the citizens. We inform you so that you can keep this democracy. You can keep the republic that was given you. In terms of the introspection, look, I have seen both sides of this. I know that a lot of people, and I really fully understand this, especially in the current age with the current attacks, just simply do not want to acknowledge that any of the criticism is in fact true, that there is a bias, and it tends to be more of a pack mentality, a uniformity of opinion. And I do think that those questions that I asked, I'm not asking for retreat. I'm not asking for navel gazing. It's just that every once in a while, it's worthwhile going, what did we miss? What did we do to feed this, if anything? Are there anything that the critics said about us that might be true? And that is one of the most painful things to do. I do understand it, but I think it's essential.
But under the guise, let me add this, under the guise of radical transparency, one of our recommendations is holding a summit of news leaders so that we can put together essentially a menu of best practices and get some level of consensus on what transparency means. And when we say this is what we do and this is why we do it, that we're pulling together a critical mass of news organizations to make that happen.
And I would just add, there's a great new book. It's called The Forgotten. It's written by Ben Bradley Jr., and it focuses on a county in northeastern Pennsylvania which voted for President Obama and then voted for President Trump. And I think that this just in-depth look and listening project that produced not just the voices from this county, but really great reporting on the impact of various economic and demographic trends. It's must reading for journalists before 2020 and for community foundation leaders, just to help understand where people are coming from during this time. Over here.
Hi, thank you. I'm Alex Newman. I'm a freelance journalist. And you guys mentioned, and I agree, that journalists are often insulated in their own little communities and tribes, and we kind of don't interact as much as we should with the outside world. And I think the 2016 election was a good confirmation of that. A lot of us were shocked. But, obviously there's a lot of misinformation out there, but how do we guard against kind of truthful information or information coming from a different opinion or worldview getting caught up in these dragnets and drowned out, especially, from marginalized communities, people who don't necessarily have a voice. We don't hear it in our talks. So how do we prevent that from getting caught up in the dragnets?
Well, go ahead, Joanne.
That really gets down to the diversity of voices in the newsroom. And when we talk about diversity, it really isn't just, we typically hear about, well, you need to have gender and racial diversity. We need diversity of viewpoints. of political viewpoints. We need diversity of class in our newsrooms. I think that's something that is really underlooked. The idea that, you know, even if you have a racially, ethnically, gender diverse newsroom, but everybody kind of grew up in a nice middle-class household and went to college, you don't have that sort of diversity of experience and connection to these communities, and that is absolutely essential. And by the way, one other diversity I would add is of age. I've been out on the speaking tour on all about gender, but I will tell you that when you speak to audiences of 25-year-olds versus 50-year-olds, you see an entirely different world. And it's so important to recognize that within your newsrooms and to be able to call on those people and to hear the voices of those who might be underrepresented. And the one other thing I would say to news leaders is there are people who are underrepresented, whether you're talking gender, race, ethnicity, LGBTQ, often are afraid to speak up. They're afraid that they won't be heard. They're not part of the majority. And I would say, you know, those are your best resources. Call on those people. Make sure that we bring them into the fold so that we can reflect their communities as well.
Let me add, though, that part of this is, to me, the influence of bad actors driving wedges within our society and using the tools that connect us to also divide us. And so I believe, and I think the commission concluded that, you know, the tech companies have a responsibility to target misinformation and disinformation, but also government has a responsibility to do that as well.
Mm-hmm. Good morning. My name is Julio Ricardo Varela. I'm a journalist at Futuro Media. Just on Charlie's point about coverage and how we are, as an industry, are covering a presidency that's actually good for business. Right, and I would love to hear Mirta also from a Spanish language perspective. So my question is, when we do breaking news and we let our national leader speak for 50 minutes endlessly, I mean, I feel like I'm in a Latin American country sometimes, and you know, I'm watching Fidel Castro or Hugo Chavez, which is what state-run television is in Latin America. So what do we do? I mean, why are we covering this presidency in a traditional way when we all know that it's not a traditional administration? So I'm just curious, I want to hear from Mirta and Charlie or anyone else is like, what's the best way?
Well, let me give you a 30-second answer there. The practice of the cable networks in 2016 to carry Donald Trump unedited was media malpractice. And I think that in reacting to the new era, I think we'll look back on that the way I think the media looked back on the McCarthy era and realized, okay, our job is not to be stenographers, and our job is certainly not to give $1 billion worth of free advertising to one candidate. And I think that you want to talk about some introspection. You know, I think the folks at Fox, forget. But I mean, you know, CNN and MSNBC really need to ask themselves a lot of tough questions about that.
I think we do need to cover everything the president says, and I think the non-traditional ways in which he has chosen to carry his message need to be covered as well, and I mean social media. Those are presidential comments, and they merit coverage, and they need to be covered. And they speak for themselves, right? But we do need to be as critical of those comments and statements as we've always been of every president. I don't think we need to be harder or easier on him, or I don't think we need to mock him. I think we need to be as rigorous with him as we have been with any other president. And I think for the most part, the press has been that way. I don't think that was the behavior when he was a candidate, because very few of us took him seriously. But now that he is the president, I think for the most part that has been the behavior. He hasn't liked it, clearly, but the serious outlets have taken him seriously, and for the most part have taken him to task when it has merited it.
We have time for 2 questions. This one.
Hi, I'm Mary Kay Magstead. I had the audio journalism program at UC Berkeley, and I'm a former foreign correspondent for public radio for a couple of decades. I was struck by something that you said, Charlie, a little bit earlier in this conversation, where you said, well, we've been talking about journalism, but let's talk about the media. And I think, you know, Dana set for us a very interesting paradigm through which to look at terms. Journalists by nature do fact-based work. We verify, we do rigorous reporting. The media includes all kinds of different entities, including those who are very aggressively not fact-based, who in fact are doing what you talked about in terms of trying to sow doubt, trying to make people like not sure what reality actually is and to lose faith in being able to believe in anything. So I personally think we as journalists should take back our term and call ourselves journalists and let the rest of the media deal with the distrust that they've sown.
And just to add to that, one thing that Dana Boyd said yesterday was that there's a void, a data void. It's called journalism void on YouTube. So I challenge every journalist in this room to go make your videos right now and figure out YouTube search right now. And because, like, why the heck should people be turning to a data void in one of the most powerful social networks that exists to inform people, and it's empty of journalism. So thank you for that.
Our last
Yeah,
question.
well, let me just respond. I agree with you completely. I mean, I think there's a real imprecision in the use of the word media, and you're right. And maybe it should be a roadmap to rebuilding trust in journalism. And maybe that's that. I mean, somebody ought to pursue that specifically, separate it out. We are journalists. This is media. They're not the same thing.
I wanted to commend. I'm Ed Wasserman, Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley. I wanted to commend the Commission for a very thoughtful and illuminating report. One element I'd like to call to your attention, there's a tendency to view the public as an audience and to view public mistrust as kind of an audience review of the news. And I want to suggest to you that the question of mistrust and trust building perhaps hinges on our willingness to identify a very important part of the population of this country. And these are people who are covered by the news and are sources of the news. And we don't really understand, we don't really have any idea what they think of us. And they're an extremely influential part of the public because their lives have been shaped by the news. Nobody's gone back, circled back a few years later and said, well, how was it for you? How were you treated? What is your level of trust in the media? Has your life been improved? Has your life been damaged? Were people straight with you? Were they honest with you? Did they seem to have your best interests in heart? I love the idea of informational fiduciaries with respect to the platforms, but is there a fiduciary relationship between reporter and source? And going to the civic training element that I really applaud, you know, we train our students to read the news. We don't train them to pick up the phone and call a reporter when they think they know something about the news. So I guess my suggestion is there's a larger challenge here. First of all, it's an informational challenge to find out how we're doing among this absolutely integrally essential constituency out there. And then there's a question of whether, wouldn't it be terrible to find out that the people who are the most familiar with our practices are the least trusting of them? And if so, then perhaps the problem is looking at our news practices, the rituals of news gathering, and finding out whether they need to be reformed as a way to re-earn the trust of the public.
Excellent.
Those are both very good points. It reminds me when I was a local newspaper editor in places like Tallahassee and Akron, I used to send out accuracy surveys to people who were quoted in stories. To get to exactly that point and to try to get some insight into, were you treated fairly? Were you quoted accurately? Did the story reflect all of the information you provided to the reporter? And we use that as a way to both review performance, but also to make sure that we maintain credibility with our sources.
Excellent.
I'm going to close, though, on this thought. And that is that I, as a primarily local journalist who is now more exposed to Washington journalism, I have been amused over the past several years about a lot of the hand-wringing about how Donald Trump treats the press, because I've often said that anything that comes out of President Trump's mouth regarding a relationship with the media is no surprise to anyone who has covered a local city hall.
Thank you, Mizell. Thank you, all of